Mr. Chairman, Mrs. McGuinness, head table guests, pioneers of 1933, and fellow New Democrats. This would be a good time for me to quit. There's no possible way that I could live up to the reputation that Grace McGuinness has just given me. And if I were to quit now and go home, you'd believe a lot of that malarkey. Unfortunately, you're going to have to listen to me, and by the time I get through, you'll realize I'm a very ordinary guy who, like the rest of you, has done the best he can to help to promote the cause in which you and I believe and to which we have dedicated our lives. When I think of Grace and her husband Angus, two people for whom I had a tremendous regard and with whom I worked in the House of Commons for many years, my mind goes back to British Columbia, where later, as you know, I had the privilege of representing people of that province in the Parliament of Canada. I always think of an old story, because I think you've been very serious here tonight. And you might like to have a laugh for a change, but the story is told of Mr. Justice John Ferris. No Grace will remember him. He's one of the Chief Justice of the Court in Vancouver. And he used to tell with great glee that he was standing looking out his window one day, and he saw a young woman going from house to house, coming down the street, closer and closer to his place. As she got close to his place, he noticed on her coat CCF. He thought he'd have a little fun. He tells the story himself. He went to the door, opened the door. She gave him some pamphlets. Then she told him about the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, what it stood for, what it represented. He listened patiently. And then he looked at her with a rather condescending smile and said, "My dear young lady, don't you know that there are three classes of people who can't vote? The mentally ill, and convicts, and judges." And she smiled at him sweetly and said, "And which are you, sir?" One of the things I tried to do when I was in politics, and particularly in the House of Commons, where it can get pretty dull for long weeks and months on end, was to try to retain my sense of humor. And every once in a while, I'd find somebody who helped in that regard. And strange to say, two of the men I remember most in that connection were senators. One was Senator Chester Clark. And he was a homely sort of chap who didn't try to sound like a corporation lawyer or a great statesman. He used ordinary phrases, and one day he was addressing the Senate. And he said, "Fellow senators, this country is like an old milk cow, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It gets fed in Western Canada. It gets milked in Ontario and Quebec. And I leave it to your imagination what it's doing in the Maritimes." As a matter of fact, there are many stories told by senators, and many of them deal with the questions that face this country. But one of the ones I remember most from the Maritimes, for those of you who are from the Maritime provinces, may remember a Liberal member called Dr. Michael Clark. And he had a rather ready wit. And I happened to hear the speech he made way back in the late 1930s. There was a night up on ports and port facilities in the Maritimes. And that was a great opportunity, of course, for everybody to make a speech. Maritime members were up one after the other. And I don't know whether you know it or not, but the Maritimers have a reputation, well justified, for being among the finest orators Canada has ever produced. And they went on hour after hour after hour, and in spite of the beauty of the oratory, it was getting a little tiresome. The last of these speakers from the Maritimes really made the welkin ring. He said, the Maritimes are the finest place in the world. We catch more fish than any place in the world. We produce the finest fish in the world. And Mr. Speaker, I don't need to tell you that fish makes brains. And Dr. Michael Clark got slowly to his feet. And he said, Mr. Speaker, I just heard the last speaker say that the Maritimes makes more fish than any place in the world. That they eat more fish than any place in the world. And that fish makes brains. All I want to say, Mr. Speaker, is that the Lord God Almighty certainly put the fish where it was most needed. Well, I'm very proud and very privileged to have been asked to say a few words about this 50th anniversary of the birth of the CCF and the New Democratic Party. These have been 50 interesting and fascinating years. And I want to take just a few minutes, without tiring you with too much history, to go back and remind you how this movement came into being. Because the thing is not to remember the great outstanding figures like J.S. Wordsworth, Angus McGuinness, M.J. Coldwell, George Williams, Agnes MacPhail, great mountain peaks. They provided leadership. But our party was built by ordinary people who believed that it was possible to have a better way of life for themselves, and that they couldn't have it for themselves, to have it for their children and their children's children. These are the people who built our movement. I'd like to just go back and try to give you quickly, we'll have to write a history to do it well, but to give you quickly an idea of the situation which obtained back in 1931, 32, and 33. The CCF, and I won't keep saying CCF and NDP, I assume that you associate together. But what gave rise to the CCF was a meeting together, a meeting of minds of three groups. First of all, the farm organizations. And they were very potent and very active. The United Farmers of Alberta had 7 or 8 members of Parliament, like Bob Gardner, Bill Irvin, Henry Spencer, several Ted Garland, Some of you will remember them. And also they had elected United Farmers Government in the province of Alberta. That group of men they sent down to Parliament with their brilliant debating ability. Newspaper men told me that, in their opinion, they were the most brilliant group that ever sat in the House of Commons. And here were these UFA members, but they were interested in farmers and farmers' problems. United Farmers of Saskatchewan, headed by George Williams and Mrs. Louise Lucas. United Farmers of Manitoba. United Farmers of Ontario, who had elected Agnes MacPhail to Parliament. These farm groups were groping for a solution to the problems that were oppressing them. The second organization which had an influence in Canada was the Independent Labour Party. Independent Labour Party, Manitoba, where you had J.S. Woodsworth, A.A. Heats, John Queen, Fred Dixon, Bill Ivins, one could go on and on. They're the people who had come up out of the Winnipeg strike. As a small boy, I stood on the roof of a building opposite the City Hall and saw the riot, and saw a man being shot in the corner of Main Street and Market Street. Never forgot that sight. The result was that in Manitoba, the ILP elected people to the legislature. They elected the mayor, S.J. Farmer, election after election after election. Down in Ontario, the same story. The Labour Party elected members. One of the mayor of Simpson of Toronto was elected year after year by the labor forces, and other communities, Hamilton and Oshawa. The same thing was true in the Atlantic provinces. These were two great forces for change, but they didn't work together. They weren't associated. They were sometimes even suspicious of each other. There was a third group. Now I want to mention this because there's been a tendency by us, and even the people who have written the history of our movement, to forget a third force. And in many ways it was, though the smallest, the most important force in founding CCF. And that was, it's been mentioned tonight, the League for Social Reconstruction, called for short LSR. LSR with its president, Frank Underhill, with Frank Scott, one of his most brilliant minds, my friend King Gordon here. I can give you a long list of these men. They were the people who helped to bring the farm and labor groups together. They were the people who, at the request of the farm and labor groups, went off and drafted the Regina Manifesto. And when the group had finished the first draft, it was King Gordon here and Frank Scott who went off to King Gordon's summer place, his family's summer place. The Winnipeg people know, of course, King Gordon was the son of the great writer, Ralph Connor. And they went off to their summer place and completed the Regina Manifesto. Well, you couldn't have had a better combination. The farmers out across this country tilling the soil, being deprived of decent living because everybody else made more money out of what they grew than they made themselves. The workers in the factories and the shops and the offices, in the forests and in the mines, and out on catching fish on the two oceans or in the Great Lakes. All being exploited. But lacking the balance and the perspective to put it together and to seek out a solution. Not just a solution for one group, but a solution for all the people who by hand or brain produced the wealth of Canada. And it was the LSR. They were the people whose contribution made such a difference to that convention. Well, you know the story from then on. The groups began to talk to each other. There was a feeling that they ought to work together, and yet there were so many things that stood in the way. And they needed a catalyst. They needed one person of whom they were not suspicious. They needed one person whom they trusted. And they found that person in J.S. Woodsworth, member for Winnipeg North Central. At first, he was very careful. At first, he merely suggested that the MPs in Ottawa from the United Farmers and from the Independent Labour Party should meet, maybe socially, maybe meet for a chat about how things were going, to talk about economic conditions because we were into the midst of a depression. Not to talk about unifying, not talk about joining together, which would have been a horrible thought for some of them, but to get to know each other and to get to trust each other. My friends, that's important. That's important. We can't work together as a socialist movement unless we learn, first of all, to be tolerant with each other, and secondly, to trust each other. And finally, Mr. Woodsworth got them to the place where they began to talk about having a joint caucus down there. Because matters were coming up in the House, and it would be a good idea to get the experience of each other. And so they formed a joint caucus, a farmer-labor caucus. And that led automatically to someone saying, well, why don't we form a farmer-labor party of some kind? We said, well, we can't limit the farmer and labor. We want the business people, we want the academic people. And somebody said, let's talk to the League for Social Reconstruction. Let's get the LSR in. And people like Frank Scott and the other members of the LSR began to have chats with them. And the idea was born that maybe we could bring these diverse groups together. Now, I don't want to give the impression that it was only happening in Ottawa. I'm simply using that as an illustration. Now, I can give you an illustration out of my own experience, which shows how it can work without you even being conscious of it. Irma and I, as Grace has said, we're in Weyburn, and we're in the midst of a drought and depression. We turned the basement of the church into a place where we handed out clothing. We had groups of people going down unloading boxcars of fruit, which we got for nothing but simply by paying the freight from British Columbia, and warm clothing, which was old, out of style, but warm. Supplies we got from Ontario. And we were running a sort of almost a social welfare center. And I recognized how inadequate this was. We're only touching at the fringe of the problem. And said, what can we do? And I thought about it for a while, and then, of course, I grew up in Winnipeg as a boy. I served my apprenticeship there as a printer. I had gone to Mr. Woodsworth's All People's Mission as a youngster. And so I sat down and wrote him a letter. Explained the situation. Got a letter back. He said, strange to say, in the same mail, I got a letter from an alderman in Regina called M.J. Coldwell, asking almost the same question that you were asking. Why don't you get in touch with him? So, in those days we didn't pay for long-distance telephone calls, let me tell you. Not on the salary we were getting. I wrote him a letter. And Mr. Coldwell and his son one Saturday drove down to Weyburn. He found the Baptist church. Somebody told him we lived right beside it. He went to the door, knocked on the door. My wife came to the door. Now, we'd been married. She was only 19. This was only a year or so after we'd been married. He took one look at her and he said, "Is your father home?" And she said, "I think you're looking for my husband." So she told him where we were, and he came over, and he said, "I've had a letter from Mr. Woodsworth. I've been asking the same sort of questions you've been asking. Let's sit and chat about it." We began to discuss what could be done. He told me he had meetings with George Williams, United Farmers, President of United Farmers, had talks with some of the men at the university who were members of the LSR. He said, "Ken, is there some way we can bring these groups together?" And that is what we resolved to do in our own little area. I invited Mr. Coldwell to come down and address a mass meeting. We had it outside in the fairground. We couldn't afford a hall, but we had it outside in the fairground. About 1,800 people turned up. And he told the story. Then we wrote to Mr. Woodsworth, see if he would come. He came. He addressed a crowd of 2,000 or 3,000 people. People were beginning to recognize that whether they were farmers or workers, whether they worked on the railroad or whether they were cleaning the streets, that they had a common interest, that this economic system had let them down and that something had to be done. And so we began to talk about bringing the different groups together. Mr. Coldwell at that time was president of the Independent Labour Party of Saskatchewan. George Williams was head of the Saskatchewan Farmers Union. The two of them got together. A little group of us met here in Regina. Some representing the farm movement, some representing the labor movement, a few representing the LSR. We talked about having a convention. We called that convention in 1932, at which time we formed the Farmer Labor Party in Saskatoon. And when the convention was over, our people jumped into their old tin Lizzies and drove down to Calgary, where Mr. Woodsworth and Bill Irvin and Ted Garland and others, Frank Scott, Eugene Forsey, and the others, had arranged for a meeting of the various groups to talk about doing on a national scale, which we had just done a few days before on a provincial scale. And as a result of that meeting in Calgary in 1932, we began to plan calling together a convention in 1933. And out the invitations went. Weren't sure how many would come. We hadn't any money. They came in all manner of means, some driving old cars, some hitchhiking on the road, many of them riding on freight cars. None of them with sleepers. Stayed out here at the fairgrounds. Very few able to afford hotels. But they met in the old city hall here. And with the program which had been drafted by the LSR, with the point of view expressed by the labor groups, and I include in that, of course, the Socialist Party of British Columbia, and the farm groups, and the LSR, began to put together the foundation of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. And so we launched the party. We had some disappointments. When Agnes MacPhail and the members from the UFO went back to Ontario, United Farmers of Ontario decided that it was bad enough to be associated with some of those people from Saskatchewan and Manitoba, but to have the Socialist Party of British Columbia in the same room, it was liable to give you a disease from which you'd never recover. And so the UFO decided not to come in. Another disappointment was that the any of the trade unions. A lot of trade unions had sent representatives to the meeting in the city. But when they went back, they found that their parent organization in the United States had a clause in their constitution which forbade them taking any active part in politics. Unlike the trade unions in Great Britain and in Europe, where most of the trade unions as a union supports the party. In Canada, these people weren't allowed even to let locals support the party. And that was a great disappointment. It was a disappointment which Mr. Woodsworth felt more keenly than I think anything else which he ever had. Sometimes of an evening in the House of Commons after the House was closed, and I would be up doing some work in my office, and we were next door to each other. Mr. Cole and I had one room, and Mr. Woodsworth had the one next door. He would drop in and chat about what was happening, and again he would say with the most sorrowful voice, "I had so hoped that the trade union movement would come in." Well, I'm glad to tell you that eventually it did come in. The trade unions in 1959 began to talk with us about coming in, not as individuals, but as a union. The thing that Woodsworth had dreamed of. And of course they ran into resistance from their members in the United States. And I see some of you here tonight who belong to the old auto workers. Well, the auto workers were meeting in 1959 in the city of Montreal. And there was a resolution calling them to form this new party that we were talking about putting together. And the international president came, he listened to the discussion, and then he rose and he made a speech lasting 1 hour. When he told them that the Constitution forbade it, that the Auto Workers Union, the United States and Canada would not permit it, and they might just well drop the resolution now. He sat down, they gave him polite applause, and passed the resolution unanimously. And as a result of that, of course, we had our convention in 1961, which time we completed what we had hoped for from way back from 1935, that we would have brought in farm organizations, academics, people in business, people in all walks of life. That this might be a party not representing one little section of the population, but a party that was pledged to raise the living standards of the people of this country, and to see that every person, irrespective of their color or their social status or their religious viewpoint or their economic outlook, that all of them would have a society which would be divine, to give to them economic security and opportunity to live a good life. Well, I don't need to review the work which the CCF has done and the NDP ever since 1933. You know that work. You can go back over the record. It was in this province that we launched hospital insurance and paid for it out of provincial revenue for 11 years before the federal government put up a paper. In 1962, the first province in Canada, a Medicare plan, and this is the man who was Minister of Health, put that plan into operation, the first comprehensive health care program in Canada. I don't need to enumerate the accomplishments of the CCF and the New Democratic Party. The record speaks for itself. There is not a single piece of progressive legislation designed to improve the lot of the people of this country, designed to make us more independent as a free people, and to enlarge the scope of our relationship with the rest of the world. Not one such piece of legislation that didn't grow out of the demands and the persistent requests of our party in the Democratic Party. It's not often that I make comments about what speakers of other political parties say, but I noticed in the paper the other day that Joe Clark, former leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, speaking in Moose Jaw said, and I quote, the NDP soon will be nothing but a memory in the minds of Canadians. The NDP will soon be nothing but a memory in the minds of Canadians. I would like to tell Mr. Clark that long after he and I are forgotten, this movement will be moving forward to make Canada a great country in which to live. But as you move on from victory to victory, as you move on to take over the levers of power as you will do, if not this generation, next generation, I would like to ask you to remember something. That is, that the growth and development of the New Democratic Party must never allow us to forget our roots. Don't sacrifice success for conviction. Don't ever give up quality for quantity. If I could press a button tonight and bring 1 million people into this party, and knew that those people were coming in for some ulterior motive, or just because they liked the hoopla and the parades and the band, but they didn't understand the kind of society we're trying to build, I wouldn't press the button, because those kind of people in a movement like ours, as socialist movements around the world have demonstrated, we're not just interested in getting votes. Of course, as politicians, we have to be interested in getting votes. But we're not just interested in getting votes. We're seeking to get people who are willing to dedicate their lives to building a different kind of society, a society found on principles of concern for human well-being and human welfare. Let me close by just suggesting 3 of the things that I hope we will make our aim and objective in the next few years. I suppose I've taken part in as many campaigns as most people in this auditorium. And yet I want to tell you that the longer I live, the more I look back with regret at the hours and hours we spent trying to tell people about a program with 19 points, forgetting that when they got to the 8th point, they'd forgotten what the first 7 were. An educational campaign is fine, but when you get into a political campaign, my friend, let's concentrate on a few things that really matter to people and that they understand. Go back and touch on them at home. Go back and talk to your fellow constituents. Talk to the people of your community. 3 goals that are ours, from which we must not shrink, and to which we must devote our last ounce of energy. And the first is that we want to create a Canada in which there is a job for every individual able and willing to work. I am amazed when I hear the talk of recovery in the United States with 3.5, 4 million people unemployed. When I hear people in Canada and editorial writers saying, oh, things are getting better. We're down to only 1.5 million unemployed. Add their dependents and you're probably talking about 3 million people who are out of a job. There can be no justification whatsoever for that. We've got to see to it that jobs are available. Not just because we want people to have an opportunity to live useful lives, but on the basis of mere selfish economics, that every person who has a job is getting a pay envelope, and that pay envelope makes them a consumer, and when he or she becomes a consumer, that stimulates the economy and provides a market for the farm produce, a market for the fishermen, and a market for the manufactured goods. That's our first job. And don't tell me it can't be done. The things that need to be done in this country. Our lakes, some of the greatest lakes in the world, our rivers, our coastal waters are polluted to the place that if we don't act within the next few years, they may be polluted beyond salvation. Thousands, millions of acres of land have been denuded by the removal of the forests that are going to blow away unless we reforest those areas. We could use hundreds of thousands of people in this country just salvaging our devastated environment. That's your number one task. And the second is, and again it's been mentioned, to save Medicare from subtle strangulation. And when you go back to your constituency and you run into somebody who says it's a good idea for you soft-hearted humanitarians, but we can't afford it, let me give you a simple statistic which you can put down on a piece of paper and carry in your head. And that is that our friends in the United States are spending 9% of their gross national product. And they get a higher per capita gross national product than we do. They spend 9% of their gross national product on health care, and 34 million of their people have no health care coverage. And in Canada, We spend 7% of our gross national product, and every man, woman, and child in Canada is covered under Medicare. But I want to warn you, as one who started out even before I was in politics, dedicated to the idea of comprehensive health insurance, fought for it through all my political life. I want to say to you that Medicare and hospital insurance are already marked for destruction unless you stop the per capita taxes and the extra billing which most of the governments of Canada are now permitting. Someone said, well, what harm can it do? What harm can it do? A per capita tax which is levied without any basis of ability to pay. A woman in Ontario with 2 children having to pay over $50 a month, $600 a year. Can she afford that? And that's levied on the basis, on a per capita basis, not on the basis of ability to pay. I know you need money to run Medicare. Al Blately and I can tell you something about the cost of that. But if we need money for Medicare or for any other humane service, let it be financed on the basis of the ability to pay and not on so much per head. We must fight as we have never fought before to say per capita tax for health care out the window. To say there must be no extra billing or extra charges. Well, you say, why? What harm does it do? I'll tell you what harm it does. It means that increasingly the people who can afford to pay the per capita tax, and it's going up, just gone up in Alberta, people who can afford to pay the per capita tax and the people who can afford to pay extra billing will pay it. And they will get the best care. They will get the most experienced surgeons and physicians. They will get into the best hospitals. And the people who can't pay, they'll take what's left. If you want a 2-tiered health program, then just continue the way we're going. And I remind you that in this movement we pledged ourselves 50 years ago that we would provide health care for every man, woman, and child, irrespective of their color, their race, or their financial status, and by God, we're going to do it. The last point I cover briefly because it had already been touched on very ably by our national leader and by others. And that is that this movement must fight as it has never fought before, in every poll, in every constituency, in every corner of Canada, to keep Canada free from nuclear missiles. Why should we require nuclear missiles? In the last 2 weeks, 2 prominent admirals, one of them, Canadian Admiral Robert Falls, who's head of the NATO military setup, yesterday's term was finished yesterday, but for the last 6 months, Admiral Falls has been stating publicly and supported by a British admiral that we now have the capacity to kill beyond anything we will ever need. And that we should not only stop, that we should begin to cut back. We have got to stop this madness. Can you tell me any reason why Canada should be joining with the United States to test the cruise missile in this country? Of course, we're all trying to find out where Prime Minister Trudeau stands. Remember where he used to stand. But now, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, he's against nuclear arms. And on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, he said we have to have nuclear arms if we want to stay in NATO. And on Sunday, he goes to church to pray for forgiveness for deserting the principles they used to announce. Well, my friends, there are a few nations who've had the courage to say they will not have nuclear weapons. And some of them much closer to the Soviet Union than we are. Countries like Norway, and Denmark, Sweden. The people of South America have told the Americans they don't want any cruise missiles there. The people of Central America don't want them. Why do we want them? Oh, they're trying to tell us now because we belong to NATO we have to accept them. That's not true. There are members of NATO who haven't accepted them and who have said they won't accept them. The fact of the matter is that we have allowed this government in Ottawa, on both sides, conservatives are equally pliable. These, I agree, more so. They don't even need to be squeezed into it. They're ahead of it. My friends, I'm pleading with you. When you go back to your constituencies, this is not an academic question. This is not something that professors work out in a theorem. This is not something that politicians just talk about like they used to talk about free trade and high tariffs. This is something that affects your life and the lives of your children. John Kenneth Galbraith, many of you remember John Kenneth Galbraith, the great economist who's done so much to stimulate the thought of the Western world. John Kenneth Galbraith is out today leading a campaign in the United States. And he's saying to the people of the United States, there are now 50,000 nuclear weapons in the world. We now have the power to wipe out every human being 100,000 times over. Why do we need more? And pleading with the people of the United States, as we must plead with the people of Canada, and say, the time has come to stop this madness. The time has come to say, first, that we will stop the deployment and the installation of nuclear weapons. And secondly, that we will start by mutual agreement around the world to demolish and destroy the nuclear weapons that are already there. Did you ever stop to think what would happen if we were to do that? Do you ever stop to think of the billions upon billions of dollars that could be liberated to destroy poverty, to rid the earth of misery, to provide health care for the people in the far corners of the earth, to build decent homes and schools and hospitals, to train nurses and doctors and teachers, to raise the living standards of mankind so that humanity could go marching forward to the great goal towards which we ought to be marching. Let me close by saying that tonight we look back 50 years. We look back with gratitude for the men and women who had the courage and determination to launch a movement based on the principle of humanity first. We're gathered here 50 years later, first of all, to express our appreciation for them and our admiration for them. But much more important, we are here to pledge ourselves to continue the work which they so courageously began, and to say to them and their memories and to the people of this country, what our forefathers began, we will continue. We will continue not with the old ideas, because times change and people change. We need new ideas to meet new situations. But the principle of organizing our society for the benefit of all the people and not for a privileged few, that is still here, and that is the principle to which we adhere. My friends, we face another 50 years. I close with these words. I hope you'll try to remember some of them. New occasions teach new duties. Time makes ancient good uncouth. They must ever up and onward who would keep abreast of truth. Lo, before us gleam her campfires. We ourselves must pilgrims be. Launch our Mayflower and steer boldly through the desperate winter sea, and not attempt the future's portals with the past's blood-rusted key. Thank you.
Look at him there.